Hi, everyone. Like I suggested may be a reality, it looks like we're going to be doing this, the remaining, or at least a bunch of lectures for a time being, remotely. So I'm recording this in my office, and I'm going to continue on with the lecture that we've been working on parsimony, and I'll record it and make it available to you. Okay, so where we last left off, we were introducing this particular graph. Now this is a graph, and the x-axis represents variation in model or theory complexity. On the y-axis, or the vertical axis, you can see it reflects increasing accuracy. Now, accuracy is how well the model can predict data, right? So there's two kinds of data that the model can predict. And that's why there's multiple lines in here, right? So the first kind of data that it can predict are data that were used to build the model. Now, when data does this, or when this type of prediction or accuracy is called postdiction, it's not called prediction. So you have a line here that represents postdiction. And what you should be seeing is that as you look at the graph, you can see as model complexity goes up, right, proceeding from the left to the right on the x-axis to models that have more parameters, you can see that the postdiction, or the predictive accuracy, the ability of the model to predict data used to build the model, gets better and better. So the more complex the model, the better it is at postdiction. Right? Now, what's interesting is that there's another type of accuracy, or predictive accuracy, which is called prediction, and it usually, well, it always has to do with the ability of the model to predict data that were not used in the model. So the best way to describe this is a situation where you have a drug and you do a drug test, right? So you do an examination of whether the drug works, you do a control versus treatment collection or treatment option with the medicine or with the drug, and you see if it works. If it works, the idea is you think that it generally works as it did for that collection of individuals in individuals outside, right? So if you're making a vaccine, you test it on a group of people, find it works, you expect it to work therefore on other people, right? That's predictive accuracy. If it does work, then your model of how the drug works, built from your experiment, tells you what will happen accurately when that vaccine is applied outside to other individuals that were not used in the initial testing, right? So this is called prediction. So predicting data that were not used to build the model. And you can see, if you look at the graph here, that predictive accuracy peaks at relatively modest level of model complexity. And then it actually goes down and flattens out. So the optimal for prediction is not the same as the optimal for postdiction, right? Now, what's interesting about that is you might say, well, I guess whether you want a complex or a simple model, or whether you would prefer one versus the other, depends on whether the goal is postdiction or prediction. It tends in science to be that the goal is prediction, right? We wish to do a test on a sample, like so sample of individuals for our drug test, and then we wish to know with some high level of probability whether that test will reflect how that drug will work in the rest of the community, the individuals that we have not yet examined, right? So that's prediction. So prediction is typically the goal, and what we can see here is that prediction peaks with relatively simple models. Now, how do they know this? Where do they get a graph like this? Well, what they can do is synthetically say, okay, let's set up a situation where we know this drug works, and we'll synthesize fake data, and then we'll sort of do a reverse engineering of the scientific process on it, and we'll see which types of models work. Now, importantly, we see two other things in here. We see two lines representing the signal and noise. Now, noise can come from a variety of different places. Most often it's from, it could be, you know, for example, in the drug case, it could be from error in measurement or subjectivity in measurement. It could also be from variation in individuals from that are included in the specific sample that have unusual characteristics. A variety of possible sources. Now the signal is basically the true signal of what you're interested in, right? So the true workability of the vaccine or the drug or something like that. And now you can see that accuracy of post-diction is basically signal plus noise. So if you take this noise model and you take the magnitude of that and add it to the signal, you essentially get post-diction, right? But that's not the case for prediction. Prediction is actually subtracts that noise. It subtracts that noise. So the question is, or what we've learned from this exercise, this reverse engineering of data, this brilliant effort by scientists to sort of understand whether we should prefer simpler models, has shown us that when data are noisy, that's when we should be most carefully examining parsimonious models, right? Because parsimonious models essentially capture the signal. They have a high signal and low noise ratio. So they're capturing mostly signal and low noise. Now, a model that has a bunch of noise in it, it's not going to be as good at predicting, right? The noise comes from the sample, the data that you've collected. So that noise is unlikely to apply to the broader population that you haven't examined or that you haven't used to create that model. So what we've learned here is that because data that we collect tends to have noise in it, we should necessarily use this approach to enhance our prediction and to ensure that our models don't have a bunch of noise built into them. So we're not, you know, like imagine, for example, in a complex model that this n isn't just sort of the last variable, but it represents noise, right? That's capturing this line. Now, is that useful if we go to predict some outcome for some data that we have not, or some individual in the population that we haven't examined as part of our experiment? No, because that noise is unlikely to apply to that individual, which means our predictive accuracy outside of the model is poor when we include that noise in our model, right? So that's one clear reason why we should err on the side of this. So you should make sure you understand the difference between prediction and post-diction. Prediction is using a model to predict an outcome for data or individuals that were not used to build that model, right? So other members of the population. Post-diction is trying to predict the impact of some treatment or whatever on individuals that were included in building the model. So let's say, for example, just a further illustration of what post-diction is. I'm going to talk about an example. Let's say in the class, I survey everybody and I determine their height and their foot size. This is a common example I like to use in stats class. And you can develop a linear relationship because people with bigger feet tend to have taller height on average. There's some noise in there, obviously, and some variation, individual level variation, right? But you can generally develop a linear model, a y equals mx plus b model from that. Now, if I use the model that I developed in the class to predict, say, one particular student in the class to predict their height from their foot size, a complex model built from that classroom data is much more likely to be accurate because it will include the noise from that data set. Whereas if I was trying to predict someone outside of the class that I hadn't used to build my foot size height model, I should err on the side of a simpler model when I build my model from my classroom, because it excludes noise from the members of that class. and from my data collection process that are not going to be helpful in the prediction process. So that should illustrate the difference between prediction and post-diction. Okay. Hold on one sec. All right. So 6 reasons why parsimonious models work. The first is signal and noise. Data are inevitably formed from a mix of those two things. Noise can be at measurement error or a variety of other things. In statistics, signal and noise are more specific and refer to treatment effects, or the signal. So the true drug effect is an example of that. And error, noise. Okay. So error, we often, it's a loaded word, but it's essentially any kind of noise or any source of noise. Okay, the noise represents the discrepancy or the difference in the data from the true signal. Okay, so the deviation of your data from the true signal. If all data contain noise, do we want our model to explain this noise? As I alluded to in the last slide, no, we don't. What we would prefer is that our model doesn't incorporate that noise, because that noise is not going to apply more broadly outside of that sample. More complex models explain more and more variation in the data set used to build the model, but differentially with respect to signal and noise. So as the model becomes more complex, the model's spending more effort explaining the noise in the data than the signal in the data, and we're not interested in the signal generally, or we're not interested in the noise generally. All right, so highlighting again what I hinted at in the previous slide, it's worth noting that 100% accuracy in post-diction is exactly equal to signal plus noise, it's worth noting as well that prediction is signal minus that noise in general, not 100%. But mostly it's worth noting that post-diction is enhanced when the model signal plus noise is incorporated. Okay. Second reason why parsimonious models work, populations and samples. So I've alluded to this as well, using the sample. If we're focused on the sample, then we're interested in post-diction. If we're focused on the population, then we're interested in prediction. Okay. Research generally has to make do with limited data. That means we've got to collect a sample, right? Response of mice to 5 different diet treatments. We're not testing every single mouse in the world. We instead take a sample and we hope that it is representative, right? What could result in error or noise in such experiments? Well, a number of things could do. We could measure something differently. There could be variation in the fragments of food that are being fed to the animals. There could be a number of things that contribute. The animals could be have some genetic variability that leads to variability in the response. Could be a number of reasons. So the mice in the experiment are the sample, while the conclusions of the experiment will be hopefully applied to the broader population of all mice, at least all pet mice probably. Okay. So I'm referring back to this as often as I can, simply because I want to make sure that this is clear. You should understand this graph. It's sort of a seminal portion of this lecture. Post-diction is essentially the use of the model built with a sample to make post-dictions or about the sample. Even post-diction isn't perfect. It depends on how complex the model will get. If the model is simple, post-diction won't quite capture it, but if it's but that's because there's noise in it. So early on, the model is picking up signal, even for post-diction, but then it starts to pick up more and more noise over here, and the ratio of signal to noise in the model gets lower. Okay. Okay. So models are optimized here at this little bump, right? And this little bump is known as Occam's Hill. For obvious reasons, Occam being sort of considered one of the fathers of parsimonious ideas, or ideas of parsimony as a criterion for theory selection. Okay. All right. So models optimizing post-diction are obviously more complex, while models optimizing prediction are relatively simple. Not minimally simple, but relatively simple. Okay. All right. As mentioned earlier, model choice is often a trade-off between fit and parsimony, and it's not always an easy trade-off. So here we have 3 lines, and we have a collection of data points. So these 3 lines represent 3 theories that could explain these data points. Which of the 3 models is preferable? That's an easy or maybe not easy example. So in this case, we have accurate data, data that is not subject to noise or error, right? In that case, we might be inclined to choose model C if we know that the data are not noisy, right? Because all of the points go through it. That means it fits the data very well, but it's certainly not the simplest. But without noise, we can probably rely on that. Now, if we see the same pattern, but with noisy data, which of the 3 models are preferable? Right, probably, I'm not going to wait for an answer since none of you are here and none of you are going to answer, but in this case, you might decide based on simplicity and the fact that there's a trade-off, that model C is more likely to incorporate noise from that data, measurement error. And in fact, the simpler model B might be preferable on the basis of simplicity. The idea being here that it's closer to Occam's Hill in its level of simplicity, and therefore it's not capturing the noise, which would be the deviations from line B to these data points, and it yet is capturing a lot of signal here. Okay, line A is kind of the garbage throw in that I always add, but it doesn't fit the data well, even though it's equally simple, right? So in that case, you can eliminate it on the basis of fit. Okay, it's also, it's not really coming close to the dots. Okay, all right. So which of these models would be different for prediction and post-diction, right? So if we're looking at post-diction, you could pick model C in both circumstances, right? If that's the goal, then model C might be better, although with accurate data over here, it's equally fit to C and B. In this case, with equal fit to C and B, even with accurate data, we're probably going to err on the side of B, because among the theories, which were B and C, that fit the data equally well, we should prefer the simplest, which is B. With noisy data, even if the dots are fit very well to C, we might choose B to lose the incorporation of noise. So that noise may lead to those deviations of the data away from line B. Okay. All right. Simpler models have other advantages. They are more readily falsifiable, and they are also generally easier to understand or more comprehensible. Simple models have fewer things to explain, right? So and fewer things to reject. So there's more capacity for us to simply eliminate some hypotheses on the basis of that. Okay. Continuing along this theme, because model choice is difficult when data are noisy, understanding how accurate a data set is essential. It's an important thing, right? So if we know whether our data are accurate, we can better prioritize fit versus simplicity. So that's an important component of theory choice as well, knowing how accurate your data are. Now, I've already highlighted in this class that one of the real improvements that has been made over time is in terms of measurement tools in science. Measurement accuracy has greatly improved to the point where perhaps in some circumstances we can expect more accurate data, and therefore we can hew towards fit more than simplicity. Okay. We might be inclined to choose theory B from experience as well. So from experience, we might recognize that beyond this data set, theory B may fit. We also may know that we may understand the model behind theory B more scientifically. Like as a biologist, I might understand that if the theory is that the number of species in a particular community is a function of how much fertility is in that community, which I know is a general rule, then I might be inclined to accept that theory simply from my experience. Okay. So another reason why parsimonious models work is related data. Data in a particular set are more closely related than are a random collection. So knowing one outcome can tell us about unknown outcomes, right? Below are equivalent conductivities of aqueous solutions of hydrochloric acid at various concentrations and temperatures. But we have an unknown in the middle, right? So what do we do? How do we understand these unknowns? What can we do to deal with that? Can we fill in that unknown, and how can we do it, right? So, hold on one sec. Yeah. So data in a particular set are more closely related than a random collection of data, right? That's what, like in this case, these are conductivities of hydrochloric acid. Now, so parsimonious models can be more accurate than their own data. Part of this answer is in this example. So parsimonious models extract additional information from related data. They focus on individual data. Traditional models examine averages across replicates. Individual data have less power in those types of models. So the idea here is that parsimonious models use the data more thoroughly. Now, if you're to look at this particular example to try to understand exactly what that means, we might be able to fill that in. And we can determine exactly what this is. Now, how would you use these data to actually calculate this? Well, if you take the average of all of the so when I ask students this, they're often like, oh, take the average of this one. Some of the students say, take the average of this one. Weirdly enough, no one ever takes the average of the angular or suggests taking the average of the angles. But the funny thing is, even though in some classes students will say, oh, you take the averages of one of those lines, nobody makes the connection that even though some are saying this way, some are saying this way, ideally what you can do is take the average of all of them, and it should be central to that. And so the estimate is 180.2, but the actual value is 180. So the average of all these values is closer to the actual value than the average of one line, right? So we're using all of these related data to estimate this value. And that's this idea of how these data are related. And that's one reason why parsimonious models work. Okay. Statistical efficiency. Our textbook introduces a model of statistical efficiency that we won't go into in detail, but it's worth understanding in general, just as a means of understanding why these parsimonious models work. Statistical efficiency measures a model's accuracy and efficiency. A high value means that you get equivalent accuracy with fewer data. Also, and ideally, that's what you want. You want to be able to get the most out of a small number of data that you have. The higher the statistical efficiency, the better the model estimates the true values. Additionally, the statistical efficiency of a parsimonious model is equal to the number of replications that would be needed, additional data sets or groups, by the full model. And now the full model is basically where the number of parameters equals the number of data points. So let's say I'm building a linear model to predict your student height from their foot size, and I have 20 volunteers. If I build a model, the full model would be y equals a plus b, and there would be 20 terms, 20 parameters, right? So where the number of parameters equals the number of data points, that's the full model. Okay, so you should know what that full model is, so don't forget, okay? Okay, so statistical efficiency basically means that your model is super efficient and you're getting the most out of your data. So there's high statistical efficiency in these parsimonious models. All right, so now I mentioned we'd get to Mendel's P's. Here we are. Okay, Mendel, what did this guy have to do with parsimony? He was interested in understanding inheritance. He was interested in pea plants. He looked at their flower color, their pea size, their pea color, the shape of the pod, the color of the pod, their flower color as well. He was interested in all these characteristics and how they were passed on. So he did a bunch of particular things, right? So he took individual dominant traits, purple flowered and white flowers, and he crossed them. He pollinated them by hand very carefully. And look how many he did, right? So he did thousands of plants where he did this. And I actually saw this garden when I was traveling for my sabbatical in Brno, Czech Republic. and it was tiny. I don't even know how he could have done it. Anyway, it was very interesting to go see, but it was also right in the city center, which I thought was right downtown. All right, so in examining Mendel's results, he did some funny things. So he looked at the F2 generation, the offspring, and he looked at the ratios of purple to white flowers, or axial or terminal flowers, a bunch of these traits, right? So the ratios is what matter. So he broke down those ratios, and in this case it's 3.15 to 1, 3.14 to 1, 3.01 to 1, 2.96 to 1, 2.95, etc., etc. Right? He looked across his ratios, and he saw that the larger the sample was, the closer his ratio was to 3 to 1. He even combined, the data weren't perfect. So even if he added all these ratios up, or taking the average across all the results, the reported ratio was 2.98 to 1. When he reported his result, though, he wrote something very specific. He wrote, "If now the results of the whole of the experiments be brought together, there is found, as between the number of forms with a dominant and recessive characters, an average ratio of 2.98 to 1, or 3 to 1. So Mendel's assumption that the true ratio was 3 to 1 appealed to parsimony, that the different phenomena were the same. So he saw that the pattern across this was awfully close, and he's recognizing that his data have noise in them, right? When you're crossing and messing with thousands and thousands of plants, there's going to be error. There's going to be pollen that gets in different places that shouldn't, and things like that, that mess up your ratio. So he recognized there was error in there and realized that probably he was getting close. The bigger the data set was, the closer and closer he was getting to 3 to 1. So he figured that the true ratio, absent that noise, was 3 to 1. So he was an early proponent of this. Now, I'm not going to go into this, but if some of you don't have any background in biology and you wish to understand what he was doing and that expectation, this is a summary of the actual genetics that goes into the reason behind that 3 to 1 ratio that he was observing. It's a very specific type of inheritance. Not all inheritance follows Mendelian inheritance like this, but it's worth sort of understanding if you would like to. That way, you can sort of reference this as need be. Okay. So subsequent experiments by Mendel using different multi-level crosses and combinations of traits and different numbers of generations all supported his 3 to 1 theory. This is an example of using cycles of deduction and induction, right? He used his data, came up with 3 to 1, then tried some different things, and still got 3 to 1. That's that process of deduction. From his theory, he made predictions, and those predictions bore out, and that gives him greater confidence in his 3 to 1 theory. So some scientists would not have taken that original 2.84 to 1 ratio any further, or 2.98 ratio if you go for the average, but Mendel did, and that was important, right? He made in doing so, he took the science a lot farther. In the end, the ultimate test of his theory was to determine what caused that ratio, and now scientists know. But now we have a greater understanding of inheritance, which Mendel didn't know anything about, and yet he still advanced science quite a distance through that process. And this was an example of Mendel averaging 7 averages and then rounding, which is a form in this case of recognizing the relationships among different data and recognizing the logic that there was likely to be error in his measurements. Okay. So why are parsimonious models more accurate then? How can parsimonious models be more accurate than their data? This seems really weird. But to consider that, we have to remember that data contain noise. So a model that excludes noise will be more accurate than the data, right? So it's like, your data are signal plus noise. So if you can subtract the noise from that data, you get more accuracy. So if parsimonious models can separate that noise from the data, from the signal, in the data, then the data are suddenly more accurate, or the model is more accurate than the actual data. So that improves prediction. Okay. For a parsimonious model to improve accuracy, the following must be true. Data have to be noisy. If there's no noise in the data, parsimonious models are not going to be more accurate. The signal must not be very small. So if the signal is very small, parsimonious models don't do much good. Okay. The objective has to be prediction, not postdiction, which it almost always is, but you should understand the difference and recognize why. The data must involve related experiments. So the example there would be Mendel's P experiments. They're very similar types of experiments with simple Mendelian crosses as they've come to be known. Those are clearly related experiments. Okay. The structure of the signal must be relatively simple compared to the noise. So noise is all over the place. The structure of the signal should be relatively simple. Okay, so a more complex and weird model, weird sort of signal will require a less parsimonious model. Okay. So those are 5 reasons to consider that. So if I were to ask you that in an exam question, though, simply reiterating this would probably not be enough to get you full marks. You would have to explain each point why those are the case. Okay. It's not important, though, that you know the true model. In fact, that's a necessity, right? Because these processes are involved in trying to establish just what is the full model. So it's important to sort of proceed on that basis and not have the answer before you set out to get one. Okay. All right, give me 1 second here. All right. So back to this model, and we should note that models optimizing postdiction are necessarily more complex. I'll reiterate that. So the full model is designated by y equals a plus b all the way to n. And remember, the full model includes the number of parameters in the full model represents the same number of data points. So if you've got a data set of 25 individuals, the null model will have 25 parameters. So a through through AA, right? If you go all the way A to C plus 1 for 25 parameters, okay? Much more complex than optimizing for prediction, right? Which is at Occam's Hill right here, this part here. That's the optimal, okay? Signal noise selectivity. Models with few parameters, ABC, capture mostly the relatively simple signal, while complex models capture more noise. Okay, by choosing a model with the right number of parameters, the part of our graph called Occam's Hill, the model will be signal rich and noise poor. So you should make sure you know what Occam's Hill is. Now there's a funny thing, a funny sort of qualification on this. It's called the variance bias trade-off. And a statistician named Stein discovered that more complex models had less bias but more variance, and that this pattern traded off. So Stein found that simpler models led to better predictions in spite of that increased bias. So the increased bias impacted prediction less than the increased variance of complex models. This is called the Stein effect. So this is yet another example of how recent mathematicians and statisticians are advancing our understanding of how to use different criteria of theory choice to get better models, right? To have better theories, to choose the right theory, the theory that has the best prediction, which is most likely to be true. Good prediction is a sign you've got the right model, okay? Direct and indirect information. So when we looked at that conductivity table, we filled in the middle cell in the conductivity table with the missing value. We used relationships among the data to estimate the missing value. Parsimonious models do this. They use data more thoroughly, examining both the direct and indirect contribution of each datum. Okay. Mendel's P's are an example of that. More data are great, but more data of a particular kind are particularly useful. So usually we think of, oh, more replicates, but more replicates increase statistical efficiency far less than additional treatments do. In fact, replications can decrease statistical efficiency by adding additional noise. So that's not what we want. So knowing more about parsimony can tell you which kinds of data benefit you to collect, right? So, and that's what we want to know. Scientists want to know how to do that. So indirect data contribute more greatly to statistical efficiency, which means you have to get less data, or fewer data, excuse me, and you have to pay less, right? So not only is it statistical efficiency, but that equates to monetary efficiency in the end. So this is quite good news because scientists generally have little interest in replication. We don't want to just collect mountains of the same data just to sharpen things up. It's annoying and expensive, and it increases the noise in those models. So for example, a parsimonious model can allow a researcher to examine the growth of 500 plant genotypes with 2 replicates with the same statistical efficiency achieved by examining 250 genotypes with 4 replicates. So that's a fantastic way of considering you can get twice as many genotypes with 2 replicates, and you get the same statistical efficiency as doing half that with more replication. So that tells you it's better to look at more genotypes. You can find out more. All right, so here's a little bit of a summary. Parsimonious models can be more accurate because they use both direct and indirect information from the data. Indirect information helps more than it harms because it increases captured signal rather than captured noise. Okay, so we're going to end off this particular chapter with an examination of some philosophical perspectives on parsimony, and we'll look at some other aspects of parsimony which are kind of interesting. The parsimony accuracy trade-off, or simplicity versus fit. The 2 criteria for theory choice are fit to data and simplicity, but it has been difficult to decide, or traditionally it has, which we should emphasize more, which we should give more weight to. The distinction between prediction and post-diction has helped because the trade-off differs greatly for the 2 of them. Okay, the trade-off for prediction is easy. Aim for the model at the peak of Occam's Hill. Studies have repeatedly shown that this Occam's Hill holds across many, many data sets, which is fascinating. Lots and lots of things in there. It's much more tricky for post-diction. Fortunately, this is almost never the goal in science. When would it be? I don't know. Maybe if you're just interested in a small group for which you can collect all the data you need. Even variation in the shape of Occam's Hill, but if you collect all those data, why would you need to predict it? It doesn't make any sense. Post-diction is almost never going to be useful. All right, so even variation in the shape of Occam's Hill for different studies tends to not make a difference. Shape will depend on the nature of the noise in the data, right? So you can imagine that that noise profile will vary from approach to approach or study to study, depending on the mechanism or method applied to the collection of the data. Prediction and truth. Predictive accuracy is generally taken as evidence of truth, and I think it should be. Edmund Halley, for example, famously identified and studied the comet that is now called Halley's Comet. He predicted when it would arrive next, but he didn't live to see it. He was correct, and many cite this as proof of his theory's truth, and they should. Citing this as a measure of truth emphasizes fit, and we know that fit is only one criteria for model choice. Right? Remember, increasingly complex models generally increase the fit of the data, but not necessarily they're not necessarily reflective of the true model of the data. Model fit requires more information on the physical processes governing the causative relationship that underpins it. So you can't just, a mathematical model is useful to a point if it's great in prediction, but you have to know what the parameters in that model mean, right? So you could fit any kind of mathematical equation to a collection of data, but true understanding comes from knowing what those different parameters represent. So A, B, and C have to mean something. And knowing those things can give you increased confidence that you understand the truth of the model, and that you don't just have some sort of mathematical artifact. Okay. So what is the true model? Usually it's something, mathematically you can build a lot of models that look like some sort of equation of prediction. The true model would not really require parsimony to identify, especially if there were no noise or measurement error. But this is, a classic example of temperature anomalies over time. So people with most recent, this is an older graph I can see now, we've got much more data than this. But this is sort of an example of measurement variation in temperature, reconstructed temperature over time. And there's lots of measurement error and noise in there, depending on where the measurement is taking place, and some measurement errors and things like that. So parsimonious models are needed, and parsimonious models can be used in cases like to understand temperature anomalies that are related to climate change, for example. Complex models frequently contain elements without any clear explanation, right? So we don't often know what C variable or D variable mean, in spite of the fact that they improve how well the model fits the data. Predictive failure is usually a good piece of evidence that the theory or model is incorrect. Sometimes truth, though, will simply be elusive. We won't know what this means. And fortunately, predictive accuracy can survive. So we won't know the truth, but we can predict accurately what's going to happen. And statistical efficiency can be achieved. In other cases, scientists find the true model and understand the true model. So even if you find the true model, you might not understand it. And not understanding it means you don't really fully grasp whether the model contains mostly noise or mostly signal, probably mostly signal if it's accurate predictably though. But truth claims should focus carefully on those aspects of a theory that evidence has produced in support of. So don't overestimate what your evidence says. Sorry, I got to click there. All right, so that basically is the kind of thing that I was just talking about. All right. Parsimony and nature. Most of this chapter has focused on the fact that parsimonious models are better, but we also stated earlier that some feel that nature itself is parsimonious, which is interesting. Necessarily, the utility of parsimonious models relies on the parsimony of nature. If nature were not parsimonious, then those models would not give us better accuracy. So is nature simple? It must be, but that's a difficult concept to grasp. We don't often think about nature as being super simple, as just about everything we do presupposes this to be true. Everything seems complicated. I mean, people normally will say, "Oh, life is so complicated." But if nature were not parsimonious, each explanation would require an unreasonably greater, basically infinite number of possible hypotheses to test, rendering science an impossible task. Right? So when I come up with a hypothesis set, it's a relatively narrow hypothesis set because there's only a few things that can lead to some natural systems having fewer species versus more species of plants. That's just the way it goes. Thank goodness for that, right? Like my job would be virtually impossible if there were infinite theories that I had to test. Just as some have been confused by laws of entropy in the face of complexity, or simplicity. Some have suggested that the existence of complexity is a problem for parsimony, right? But many things, for example, are complicated. Parsimonious approaches do not interfere with the possibility of finding complex theories. The burden in these cases comes from extra information, though. We just need more data and more carefully collected data, really. So using parsimony as a criteria for theory choice does not eliminate the possibility of finding complex theories, which is important. Science can still find support for those theories related to which suspect is guilty of murder, even if the suspect, the eventual sort of explanation for which suspect is guilty is quite complicated, right? So, we can, those TV shows that I discussed last lecture, where the crime is super complex and all over the place, that can still happen, and we can still come to the conclusion that that theory is correct. Okay. Scientists generally have a sense of which problems are simple, right, versus which problems are complicated. So, for example, climate is somewhat complicated, right? There's a number of things that can contribute to global climate patterns, right, from the sun to certainly seasonal differences, annual differences, differences in tidal effects, things like that, and CO2, of course. So there's many different parameters in a model of climate. Interestingly, science is not generally about simplicity, but about exploring complexity. So scientists have to be careful not to bias ourselves towards accepting complex theories or favoring simple theories to where the data tell us we should do otherwise. All right, and now to this last section here, other aspects of parsimony. Two things, or implications, if you will. Two things can be done to improve the use of data. Lots of data can be collected, but used to generate a parsimonious model, increasing accuracy, right? So we get a lot of data, and we just use great models, we get increased accuracy. Or we can collect fewer data, spending less time and less money, and generate a parsimonious model maintaining previous accuracy levels. So if we're comfortable with our level of accuracy, we can just do a better job and be more efficient, saving time and money. Given that there is infinite questions that we can ask as scientists, it's probably a good idea. Okay. Parsimony is used as a criterion for many things. So understanding evolutionary relationships, we often build these what are called phylogenetic trees. Now these phylogenetic trees are organized according to common ancestors. So the common ancestor of this group of dinosaurs and Diplodocus is not assigned a name, but is recognized as occurring here. With further changes coming further down the chain, the ends of this being most recent, and of course you can see birds are descended from the dinosaurs. There's lots of new evidence coming every day to accentuate and explain how that came to be. I think just the other day I saw an article that they found the smallest dinosaur, bird-like dinosaur ancestor out there, and you can see a little reformulated picture of it. Now, what does parsimony have to do with this? Well, these relationships are often built using parsimony as the criteria. So they basically build these so that the number of changes in characters are minimized. So the number of times that characteristics of these dinosaurs change in a particular way is minimized across this phylogeny. So there are fewer bends and circuitous jumps in these kinds of phylogenies. And parsimony it basically means like what is the evolutionary sort of linkages between these groups of dinosaurs if we assume the least number of changes, if we assume the simplest path to getting them. And that's one criteria, that's one way that parsimony is used. All right, you can buy a funny Occam's razor shirt if you want somewhere. I don't know if this still exists, but I saw it one time. I thought it was too funny to avoid in this lecture. And then we end up with some questions, sample questions there that you can explore, including the main one, which would probably be to explain this graph carefully and accurately. Okay, and that's where we're going to wrap up this. This was my first effort at recording one of these, so I hope I did an okay job, and I feel like I went kind of fast, but you can always go back and check on it. And you can contact me if you have particular questions for clarification. Thanks.